FM stereo, radio 1, the UK's favourite.
Hi, Annie Nightingale here. For the next 90 minutes, Radio 1 celebrates the 20th anniversary of an album released on the 1st of June, 1967. The Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which you can hear tonight on compact disc for the very first time anywhere in the world. There's comment from the people involved in its making, such as the album's producer George Martin, its sound engineer Geoff Emerick, and of course, the Beatles themselves. Sgt. Pepper is often described as the greatest pop album ever made. Here's a quick trip through the LP to illustrate why. A splendid time is guaranteed for all. Released on the 1st of June 1967, and the culmination of 129 days or 700 hours of recording, the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album had been eagerly awaited. Only 5 years before, in June '62, the Beatles had nervously auditioned for EMI Records. By 1967, they had become the biggest commercial and musical phenomenon ever seen in the world of popular music. The launch of their 8th LP was a world event, making such an impact on listeners in 1967 that most can remember exactly where they first heard it and their reaction to it. Producer and artist Alan Parsons.
I've never sat through an album from start to finish and be quite so utterly bowled over by one record. I mean, when She's Leaving Home came on, I could definitely feel a tear in my eye. And it really did sound amazing. And just the idea of all those sounds which had never been heard before, I think it can safely be said that the Beatles totally reshaped the way people think about sound recording.
Sgt. Pepper's producer was George Martin.
When I started in the record business in year dot, the ultimate aim of everybody was to try and recreate on records a live performance as accurately as possible. But then we realised by this time that we could do something other than that. In other words, a film doesn't just recreate a stage play, it's something else. So without being too pompous, we thought we were into another kind of art form where we were actually devising something that couldn't be done any other way. And you were putting something down on tape that could only be done on tape.
George Martin and the Beatles had begun their experimentation with sound on their earlier LPs, notably Rubber Soul and Revolver, released in 1965 and '66. Revolver had closed with the song Tomorrow Never Knows.
It was very much an experimental track. John had written this song, which he'd taken the words from the Book of the Dead, and he said to me, I want my voice to sound like a Dalai Lama singing from a Tibetan hilltop. So I thought, well, I wonder what time the next plane is to Tibet. But then I thought, well, that's a clumsy way of doing it. So what we did actually is to put his voice through a Leslie speaker to give a kind of weird effect. And we had this tambura drone incessantly going with Ringo's drums. But the thing that made it interesting was all these little tape loops, as you know, which make the kind of squirky, like seagull noises occasionally and all kinds of weird things. Well, what had happened there was that Paul had discovered that playing with his little Grundig tape recorder, if he removed the erase head, he could actually put a loop of tape, join it up into a loop about 2 feet long, around the spools, and then anything he played, just one little guitar phrase, would record and reach saturation point and wouldn't absorb any more, and would keep on recording itself. And then he would take that loop off and do another thing with another loop.
The recording engineer on both Sgt. Pepper and Revolver was Geoff Emerick.
They used to bring their little tape loops in little plastic bags in the mornings and stuff, you know, and we used to sort of feed them up on faders. I mean, our mixing consoles then were just 8 inputs and 4 outputs, so we could only feed 8 sound sources into the whole mixing console. And we used to have gigantic tape machines, and to actually physically put these little 7-inch loops of tape on these gigantic tape machines, we used to really get the maintenance engineers down into the control room. And they used to stand there with pencils, holding all these loops of tape, to stop them sort of spilling off the tape machines. It was quite a sight, actually. You used to get 5 or 6 people standing there with just holding the pencils all day long.
Tomorrow Never Knows, the last track on the Beatles' 1966 album, Revolver. The use of the studio and tape effects continued when their next recording sessions began on the 24th of November 1966. George Martin.
When we started recording the next album, which wasn't called Pepper at that stage, we started off with Strawberry Fields and When I'm 64 and Penny Lane. And then we all went home for Christmas, and we got back in the studio after Christmas to start recording again. Well, what happened was, of course, that Brian Epstein wanted a single. And it's difficult to believe now, but he was genuinely frightened that the Beatles were slipping. And he wanted another single out that was going to be a blockbuster. So I put together Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane, said, if this isn't a blockbuster, nothing is. And I still think that, by the way. But we had such high-minded ideas in those days that we didn't think it was fair game for people to, having already spent their pounds on buying a single, to have it included in an album. We thought we should give them virgin stuff on the album, which is amazing today. I mean, tell Michael Jackson that, please. And nowadays, you've got to have a single and an album. But we didn't think that way, so we excluded Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane from the album that later became Sgt. Pepper. I wish we'd had it in, actually. I mean, it could have made an even better album than it was.
Paul McCartney's song Penny Lane and John Lennon's Strawberry Fields Forever both brilliantly evoked their childhood years. Musically, the single introduced new sounds with the high piccolo trumpet and feedback of Penny Lane and the intricate fusion of an orchestral and an electric version of Strawberry Fields Forever. The Beatles had announced that their concert touring days were over and that they would devote themselves entirely to writing and recording. Their single of February 1967 was the first result of their new freedom and clearly would have been impossible to reproduce on stage. As they started their first post-touring sessions, there was one particular album that affected Paul McCartney's approach to their new LP.
The big influence was Pet Sounds, Beach Boys. That was the album flipped me. Still does, actually. Still one of my favourite albums of all time. Just because the musical invention on that is like, wow. But that was the big thing for me. I just thought, oh, dear me, this is the album of all time. What the hell are we going to do? So Sgt. Pepper kind of eventually came out, basically from the idea that I had about this band. It was going to be an album of another band that wasn't us. We were going to call ourselves something. And just imagine all the time that it wasn't us playing this album. And it was just a nice little mind warp to get you to see the album, because when you're too close, it lent distance to the album. So I had this song written of Sgt. Pepper, and he was 20 years ago, and he taught us to play, and we're his protégés, and here we are.
Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was first heard in Britain when John Peel introduced the LP on Big L, the pirate station Radio London. It received its first official airing on the BBC light programme show Where It's At.
This is Paul McCartney saying, this is where Chris Denning's at. This is where it's at, Chris. Take it.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, this is Chris Denning on the first of the new 90-minute Where It's At programmes. And, apart from the usual show, for this week only, a special bonus. Kenny Everett, here in the studio, talks to the Beatles on their new LP, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. For an introduction, over to our commentator, John Lennon.
We're sitting in the hushed semicircular theatre waiting.
Ringo Starr on a track from the new Beatles album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Also, during the next X minutes on the BBC Light Wireless programme, we're going to be playing most of the tracks from the album, so stay tuned. And we're going to have wonderful words from the Wise Four. Well, by George, in the studio we have old Ringo Starr of the Beatles fame. Ringo, what have you been doing since I last saw you in America a year ago?
Very much.
Really?
Well, I went on holiday, we made an LP, we've made a few more tracks, we've sort of been busy.
What do you think of this new LP? It's a bit strange compared to the others. Would you term it psychedelic?
Only if you want to think of it as psychedelic.
Kenny Everett talking to Ringo Starr on Where It's At, broadcast on the 20th of May 1967. The large amount of hours the Beatles had demanded to record Sgt. Pepper caused problems for their record company and George Martin.
They could really dictate what they wanted to do, so that when they wanted to record, everybody moved out of the way. If Cliff Richard had number 2, then the managing director of EMI had to ring up Cliff and say, Cliff, would you mind giving up number 2 because the Beatles want to come in? Which didn't make us all that popular, actually. But consequently, that I would often get a phone call at 10 or 11 in the morning from Neil Aspinall saying, George, boys want to come in tonight at 8 o'clock. And if I'd say, well, sorry, I can't make it, Neil, he would say, well, unmake what you're doing, would you? And that was the kind of thing. Invariably, we worked evenings, quite sometimes afternoons, rarely mornings, because they were still asleep. I was chatting to George recently, a couple of weeks ago, before he went off to America to finish his new album. And we was talking about Pepper, and I was saying, I objected to the way people always talked about the drug taking in those times. As because I never took drugs. And I said this to him, and he said, yes, you did. I said, of course I didn't. He said, you did. I said, how can you say that, George? He said, because I slipped it in your coffee to keep you awake. I said, you devil.
While George Martin was unaware of the pet pills surreptitiously given him, the Beatles continued their experimentation with marijuana and particularly the hallucinogenic LSD. However, they were still careful to hide their drug taking from their producer, as Geoff Emerick remembers.
John one night came up from the studio into the control room and said, oh, George, I do feel really funny, and he sort of pointed to the ceiling of the control room and said, look at that, George, And George said, oh, yeah, I did. George didn't really quite know what was going on, and George ended up taking John onto the roof of Abbey Road Studios and leaving him there, thinking he was a bit dizzy or faint, because someone had actually put some substances in his coffee or something. And whereupon, when George came down and told the others that he'd left John on the roof, the others just rushed up the stairs to grab John, obviously.
Now I'd like to play you one. That's a sad little song. Where's it gone? Oh, this is it, yeah. Picture yourself on an old-fashioned elephant. Lucy in the sky for everyone. Now.
He was, in fact, Lucy O'Donnell, a young schoolmate of Julian's. It had been Paul McCartney's idea to programme the Sgt. Pepper album to sound like a fantasy concert. John Lennon, talking in 1973, expressed his indifference to Paul's theme.
Personally, I tend to be a chameleon, Whoever I'm with or whatever I'm around, I become that, and I just go into it and I go out of it. And people say, well, he's in it, he's out of it, but it doesn't mean anything to me. I'm just drifting around. Maybe we took ourselves too seriously or whatever. I can't even remember. I mean, the song Sgt. Pepper should have been left as straight rock, I always thought, but, right, and forget about Billy Shears, just do the song. But there was 4 of us then, and so we had to sort of compromise. And a concept album is a joke to me, and I don't make them, So are pop operas, But I'm not putting anybody down that wants to do it. It's wonderful, if you want to, write a jazz pop song or a, what the hell is it, It's still just, backbeat and try and make it under 3 minutes.
Paul's getting better with John's wry contribution. It can't get no worse. This is Annie Nightingale with Radio 1's celebration of the 20th anniversary of the Beatles LP, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, heard exclusively on CD for the first time in the world. Fixing a Hole, another of Paul McCartney's songs on the album, which is followed by She's Leaving Home.
It's almost like a little opera, this. And it's one of the best constructed songs they've ever had, I think. And the lyrics are particularly telling. I'm amazed, actually, that they did this at their age, because they could see the conflict between the young and the old. And John's words, I think it was John's idea for the old couple to be the Greek chorus in the background. What do we do that was wrong, And he was looking at it from the misused old people, and also the conflict between that and the young girl. So it was originally, undoubtedly, Paul's song, but I think John contributed quite a bit in that way, with the kind of answering chorus.
She's Leaving Home features an orchestral score which, for the first and only time, was not written by George Martin, but by Mike Leander.
Mike did a very good score on it. I wasn't available because Paul wanted it done at the drop of a hat. And I was recording Cilla Black on the day he wanted to go through it. So that was the one that got away. That was the score I didn't do. I minded like hell.
She's Leaving Home. The girl's appointment with a man from the motor trade was a jokey reference to a car dealer friend of the Beatles, Terry Doran. The next song on the album was inspired by an old poster bought by John in an antique shop in Sevenoaks. Being for the benefit of Mr. Kite, included almost word for word details of a show that promised a splendid time is guaranteed for all. Producer George Martin translated John's atmospheric lyrics into sound.
He wanted to hear the sawdust on the ring. That was the kind of brief he gave me for the sound picture. And it presented a nice problem. I said, what you really want, John, for this is a sound of a calliope. He said, a what? I said, a steam organ, one of those tooty things like Walt Disney thing. And I thought, well, it might be possible to get hold of a steam organ and actually use that. That'd be a good idea. But that was a bit of a wild idea, and it was too cumbersome, would have taken much too long to have done. So not being able to get a steam organ into the studio, I got as many recordings of steam organs I could find, and we transferred them to tape. And they were all Sousa marches and things like Scotland the Brave and that kind of thing. So I told the engineer, Jeff Emmerich, to chop them all up into 1 foot lengths. And he did that. I said, now throw them all up in the air. He did that. I said, now pick them up again and stick them together again. So he did that. And it wasn't quite as effective as I thought, because some of the bits came together too well. They joined up in the way they started, you know. So I said, that's no good. Turn that one round back to front. So eventually we made up a background tape, which was just chaos. It was just cacophony. It was just nothing at all. But undeniably, it was the sound of a steam organ. It was just a whirly gig noise. And so we laced that in at the background as a kind of very, very gently, very soft sound at the back, which gave the effect of a fair.
Being for the benefit of Mr. Kite is also a good example of how the Beatles' singing was being coloured by a device called ADT, or artificial double tracking.
Artificial double tracking is taking an image of the sound and delaying it slightly, or advancing it, if you like, slightly, so that it forms a double. If you think in photographic terms, like having two negatives, and when you get one negative on top of the other, exactly on top of the other, it's just one picture. So if you have one image, one sound image on top of another, exactly, then it only becomes one image. But move it slightly by just a few milliseconds, and at around about 8 or 9 milliseconds, it gives you a very kind of boxy telephone-like quality. Below that, depending on the frequency you're signalling, it will move. If you move it about, it'll give you a phasing effect, which is rather like what broadcasts coming from Australia used to sound like, a kind of in and out effect. Now, if you take the image further away to about 27 milliseconds in time, you get what we call artificial double tracking. It's got a definite two voices. Take it even further, up to about 100 or 110 milliseconds, and you'll get a kind of snap echo like Elvis Presley used on Heartbreak Hotel. And that's really how you explain it.
ADT received a nickname coined by George Martin.
John Lennon was very impressed with this. He was always impressed with things that seemed to be magic to him. And when he found out we could actually put a device on his voice that gave a double track effect, he asked me how it was done. And being typically sort of sending him up a bit, I said, well, it's a bit complicated, John, but if you listen to me carefully, you'll understand it. You see, you take the initial signal and you feed it back through a double bifurcated splushing flange, and then with negative, and by this time he sort of said, and he realised I was fooling him. Well, flange was a favourite word of mine. I called Matt Monro Fred Flange for Peter Sellers. And so he said from then on, whenever he wanted an ADT effect on the voice, he said, all right, George, flange it for me, will you?
How long did you take over technical details like phasing?
Phasing is great.
Yeah.
Double flanging, we call it. Now, there you go. Right, we're on the same thing. Flanging is great, right?
Yeah, you used it
We're
on
always
Lucy in
doing
the
it.
Sky.
Look, you name the one that isn't on, you know, you name it. You spot it, you get a prize, and you get a Sergeant Pepper badge.
Being for the benefit of Mr. Kite. Side 2 of Sgt. Pepper opened with the only George Harrison song on the album, Within You, Without You. His experimentation with Indian music had begun by chance when he picked up a sitar during the filming of their second movie, Help. By 1967, he was studiously learning the sitar, and the tune of Within You, Without You was influenced by the music lessons called sargams, devised by his teacher, Ravi Shankar. The words also embraced the Indian philosophy that George was discovering in 1967.
When I first noticed that I was interested in this, with the music first of all, I think, and along with that I'd heard stories of people in caves, yogis as they're known, people levitating and dematerializing and doing all sorts of wondrous things. And then through the music, with meeting Ravi, it was great because he's a Brahmin, which is a sort of high sect. And just all the groovy people are Brahmins, like the scientists and religious people and musicians and all those. And I learned a lot from him, and by going to India, I realised that there was more to all these rumours and mystic stories that you hear about in the West. There's more to it. They're actually there doing it, and it's real, and it's great. And so one thing led to another, just like snowball, got bigger and bigger. And then in the end, I'd like to become this myself. I'd just like to have this quality that these people have, which is a spiritual thing. And I think with us having all the material wealth that we need, then, you know, the average person feels that if they had a car and a telly and a house, and that's where it's at. But if you get a car and a telly and a house and even, you know, a lot of money, it's life's still empty because it's still all on this gross level. And what we need isn't material, it's spiritual. We need sort of some other form of peace and happiness.
George Harrison with Indian musicians and orchestra, but no other Beatles on Within You, Without You. The laughter you hear at the end of the song was a nice touch to balance the solemnity of the track. However, if you remember the laugh being louder, more like this... it's because you heard a mono version of the LP. Back in 1967, LPs were produced in both mono and stereo versions. Jeff Emerick.
In those days in England, the stereo didn't play that much importance in recording, and we actually monitored the whole recording of Sgt. Pepper through one loudspeaker as a mono record. We never actually listened to it in any stereo form, and when it came to the mixing, we took 3 weeks to mix it with the Beatles in attendance. I mean, that was part of the sessions in case anything needed replacing or adding. They were towards the end of that 3 weeks going on holiday. And as I said, we spent the 3 weeks on the mono. Then the stereo had to be done as a separate mix because you didn't tap your mono source from the stereo as you do now sometimes, or we used to then. So George and I just sat there for basically 3 days and mixed the stereo. The mono is the version to have because that's what the time and effort was put into.
Stereo did eventually become the dominant form for music, but in the early part of the album's life, more mono copies were sold. If you have a mono copy, treasure it, because mono versions of Sgt. Pepper have been unavailable for some years. The next song on Sgt. Pepper was When I'm 64, which John told me about back in the 60s.
64 was something Paul wrote when we were in the cabin. We just stuck a few more words on it, like Granny on your knee and Vera, Chuck and Dave. It was just one of those ones that he'd had, that we've all got really. You know, there's half a song that there's always... Well, this was just one that was quite a hit with us. I think we used to do it when the amps broke down, you know, just sing it around the...
Paul's When I'm 64, which dovetailed neatly into his idea of a fantasy concert, an idea which he wanted reflected on the cover of the album.
Originally, the cover was going to be us, dressed as this other band, in kind of crazy gear, but it was all going to be stuff that we'd always wanted to wear, all stuff that, like, we always secretly really liked, and it may have been... and we were going to have photos on the wall, which were all our heroes. And it could be anything. It could be Marlon Brando in his leather jacket, or it could be Einstein. It could be anybody we'd all ever thought, oh, he was good. And it was going to be this band and all their cult heroes. Mm-hmm. And we kind of put this other identity on them. That was how it turned out. You know, the cover got changed a lot, you know, in the process. But that was the basic idea behind it, yeah, kind of fantasy show, you know.
At the suggestion of art gallery owner Robert Fraser, the cover was staged by artists Jan Harworth and Peter Blake.
I think what I offered to it was the idea that if they played a concert in a park, the cover could be a photograph of them just after the concert with a crowd who'd been at the concert watching them, and that if we did it by making it life-size cutouts, it could be a magical crowd of whoever they wanted. So I then said to each of the Beatles, make a list of the people you'd like most. So it was the opportunity to kind of show off and then have the audience that you choose to be your favourite audience. I mean, this was the idea. So I said to them, you make a list of the people you'd like to be in your ideal audience, and I made a list, and Robert Fraser made a list. So I think there were the 6 lists. John's I remember most. Amongst a lot of other people, chose Adolf Hitler and Jesus, of course.
Adolf Hitler and Jesus Christ were not allowed into the mythical audience. Also, Gandhi was eventually painted out because of EMI's anxiety about their business interests in India. The Beatles were joined on the cover by luminaries in cardboard cutout, like Lenny Bruce, Bob Dylan, Oscar Wilde and Edgar Allan Poe, plus Madame Tussauds wax models of Sonny Liston, Diana Dors and themselves. A cover so vibrant with visual information was eagerly searched for clues by fans. In 1969, it was used as evidence that, in fact, Paul McCartney had died and had been replaced by a clever lookalike. After all, wasn't that the Mafia sign of death on the cover?
There was a hand above Paul's head, which was a symbol of death. And in fact, it was the man standing next to him, who is Izzy Bonn, whose most popular song was My Yiddish Mama. And in the photograph, he's waving to his fans. So it's pure coincidence that the hand is above Paul's head. I was with Paul on the day that the rumour broke. And he said to me, yes, it's true. He said, I'm not actually Paul McCartney. He said, you know Paul McCartney, and he didn't have a scar on his mouth. He said, I'm very like him, but I'm actually not him. And I looked, and there was a scar, and Paul didn't have a scar. But what had happened was that he'd fallen off his bike or something and got a scar since I'd last seen him. And, of course, it was Paul. But he kidded me. For 2 minutes, I absolutely believed.
Paul, of course, has his back to the camera on the reverse of the cover, and Beatle myth states that it was Beatle roadie Mal Evans standing in for him. Time to dispel that rumour. Everyone involved in the photo sessions confirms that Paul was present. The cover caused EMI and the Beatles manager Brian Epstein endless worries about the legality of reproducing celebrities' photos. An attempt was made to obtain permission from those depicted, but by all accounts it was abandoned. Brian Epstein, in a moment of angst, scribbled the instruction, brown paper bags for Sgt. Pepper. A sleeve staged by fine artists reinforced the idea that the Beatles were moving pop music into the realm of art. They had already received earnest criticism in the Times and other serious journals. John Lennon.
You see, intellectuals have the problem of having to understand it and then listen to it. They can't feel anything, so that's their problem. So the only way to get to an intellectual is to talk to him and then play him the record. You couldn't put a record on and then let him hear it. So the intellectuals had to read about it first and then hear it. So the guy in the Times, whoever he was, who wrote that thing about Mailer's fingers or whatever the hell he wrote, was Sood's Corner, but it worked, and we were flat.
John's song Good Morning, triggered by a Cornflakes television commercial. The sound effects were arranged so that each animal was a predator of the previous one. George Martin.
We put a hell of a lot of sound effects on that thing. And that's where, when the editing came along, that sort of moment where Pepper grew almost by itself, when at the end of the effects we have a little chicken squawking. And I knew I wanted to segue into the reprise of Sgt. Pepper. And at the beginning of Sgt. Pepper, on the warm-up, there is a guitar lick. And the guitar lick sounded just like the chicken to my ears. So I put the two, actually scissor cut the two together. So the chicken turns into a guitar. And that was one of the nice things, I think, that happened, that Pepper seemed to grow of its own accord.
With the reprise of the Sgt. Pepper song, the show was over. But one song remained as an epilogue for the album, A Day in the Life. It had been the first song recorded in the sessions following the Christmas break and featured a 41-piece orchestra.
The leader of our orchestra was David McCallum. Now, he was the leader, in fact, of one of the big orchestras in London at the time, and he was also, coincidentally, the father of the David McCallum, who was the man from Uncle, who was a big star at the time. And I do remember going into the studio after I'd been in the control room listening to a playback, because I was conducting the initial amounts. After I'd listened to a playback, I went back into the studio and I found everybody wearing funny hats and silly noses and carnival novelties. And David McCallum was wearing a big red blob on his nose like a clown, and Eric Grunberg, who was sitting next to him, was wearing a monkey's paw on his bow hand. And they all had carnival streamers all over, and everyone was giggling around like mad. And it was really very funny, actually. And they played like that, too, monkey paw and all.
Do you like to have a lot of people in the studio when you're recording, or do you like to do it completely alone?
It doesn't matter. We had a lot of people on some of the tracks, and sometimes we use them, and then ask them to clap and that. Depends if it's good people who don't hassle anyone and don't try and mess a session up, then it's great, because it's good company.
I hear you had the Rolling Stones in this session.
They came down, because we had a lot of people there, because it was a big session, and we wanted to make a happening happen. And it happened.
The carnival atmosphere of the session for A Day in the Life was filmed and made into a promotional clip which has rarely been seen. However, it provided a role model for the All You Need Is Love session broadcast around the planet in the TV programme Our World, June 1967.
The nice thing about the Beatles at this particular period of Sgt. Pepper was that we would try anything. Everybody wanted to. It was continual experimentation. I mean, on The Day in the Life, for example, that was a song which was written by the two of them quite separately. John had the idea originally for the first bit, and he said to Paul, I don't know where to go from here. And Paul said, well, I've got this other song I've been working on. What do you think of it? And that was the middle bit. And so they joined the two bits together to make one song. And it was Paul's idea to leave 24 bars empty, which we will fill in later with something. Big question mark. What the hell are we going to do with it? Well, let's worry about that later. Let's put the 24 bars down anyway. And in order to keep the 24 bars regular, because we didn't have to worry about not having 24 bars, we got Mel Evans, the roadie, to shout out 1, 2, 3, 4 with every beginning of each bar. And in order to make that sound less boring, we put Take Poker on him. So by listening to the original tapes, which I've been doing recently, opening up the 4 tracks before we ever put the orchestra on it, you hear Mal's voice there saying 1, 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, 3, and so on, as the bars go through. And at the end of it, just to make sure we didn't forget, on the 24th bar, he sounded an alarm clock. Now, those with very keen ears can listen to Day in the Life, and you can actually just about hear that. You can hear the voice in the background.
When you get down to it, it was nothing more than an album called Sgt. Pepper with the tracks stuck together, with a few soundtracks. When you really be specific about it, but it was a beautiful idea then, but it doesn't mean a thing now. And when you get down to each individual music on it, there's Day in the Life, and I can't think of anything else. When you get to it, Sgt. Pepper was a day in the life.